Hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne beneath this halo of gold, welcoming you back to my channel. Thank you very much for finding me. If you're new here, I post every week on a Friday about growing cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia. Although today I wish it was Melbourne in Florida without a greenhouse or grow lights or humidifiers, just me and my orchids indoors or outdoors or not at all. So plant lovers, if that sounds of any interest to you, do hit subscribe. I post every week and my ramblings are very amateurish, but I do try. Okay, shall we address the elephant in the room? Literally, look at the size of this thing. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, plant lovers of the world, orchid aficionados, this is my Dendrobium Speciosum, which I bought just over a year ago on Facebook Marketplace, kind of with no identification. And it has rewarded me with two enormous spikes of bloom this spring. So I think, given that, it's time for us just to review the situation, as Gilbert and Sullivan may have said, and just look at what I've done for the year to get it to bloom, how I could get it to bloom more. There's only two spikes, it's a big plant. So anyway, let's go through the whole growing care process of this famous Australian orchid, the Dendrobium Speciosum. Firstly, I made a video about when I bought this and repotted it just over a year ago, so I will link that above and below so you can see just what happened. And what did happen was that it didn't really do much. So I repotted it in autumn of last year, and in the normal scheme of things it would have bloomed in spring last year, but it didn't, and I forgave it because I just repotted it. It was just, you know, getting used to its environment. We then had a 12-month cycle. We've gone through winter and ta-da! So these do start to bloom from late winter through to spring, really depending on which part of the country you are and how warm it is. Obviously, I'm further south, so these are a little later in coming into bloom. But essentially, it's a spring flowering orchid. Now, I know this is a popular orchid around the world for people to try and grow. So let's go through some basic information to help you, if you're not in Australia, try to grow this fabulous orchid. So let's start with where it comes from. But you know what? I know you love it when I quote the holy book, the great book of Australian orchids, Orchids of Australia by W.H. Nichols. This is the most amazing book, which I got in a secondhand store for $75, which sounds a lot, but you try and find this book for a better price. I dare you. Anyway, let us consult the holy book about Dendrobium Speciosum, and it says, a widespread and variable species that grows on rocky outcrops, sheer rock faces, or high on the trunks of rainforest trees. It produces its best displays when massed on cliffs exposed to the full sun, with the leaves and bulbs bleached and leathery. And its natural range is from the Cooktown area of northern Queensland through eastern New South Wales to far eastern Victoria. Now I'll show you on the map where all that is. But I am much further south than that. So this is not the native habitat of Dendrobium Speciosum. It is a warmer climate orchid. But you know what? Here it is, living its best life in Melbourne. So there are a few salient points to garner from this. The common name for this orchid is the Rock Orchid. Ta-da! Because as we read, it's a lithophyte. It's also an epiphyte, but a lithophyte that can colonize nooks and crannies in rocks and cliff faces, as you saw, and form quite a tangled mass. Now, I have seen these planted in full sun in botanic gardens in Sydney and also in Victoria, planted either on tree stumps or in rocky outcrops in full blazing sun, tough as nuts. The only negative with that, though, is that being in full sun, which it can certainly take, and in fact needs to bloom well, so we'll get to that. The only problem with that is that you will get sun damage to the leaves and you will get really wrinkled, leathery pseudobulbs. So the plant doesn't look great, but it will flower amazingly. So in cultivation, I think you kind of got to try and find a good balance. So there is a house just around the corner from me that's got a massive clump of these in the fork of a maple tree, a Japanese maple tree. So it's not a huge tree, and it starts to fork at about 1.5 meters, about 4 feet off the ground, and the Speciosum is nestled in the fork of that tree. So it's getting lots of sun in winter and then dappled light in summer. And it seems to be quite happy. So you do often see them in the forks of trees growing in gardens and botanic gardens here in Melbourne and also in Sydney. But as I said, and as we read, it can also take full sun in a rocky situation. So the moral of the story is this plant needs as much sun as you can get it. And I think the reason why I only have 2 spikes is that quite simply, this plant doesn't get enough sun. Now, I can't do much about that at the moment, but in our new place, I will certainly just bake it. Bake it, baby. So at the moment it's outside. I've shown you a few times where it lives, and I'll link a video where you can see where it's living, which is my grow space video. So it's with actually my cymbidiums, but it's at the end of the row, so it gets more light. So it gets more light in winter because the trees that are behind it are deciduous, and because it's kind of at the end, it gets quite a lot more direct sunlight in this time of year, so coming into spring and summer. Still not enough direct light though to really make it ping. So with a Speciosum, there's no reason why you won't get flowers from each of the pseudobulbs, well, these canes. No reason at all. The only reason you wouldn't is that it's not getting enough light. That's it in a nutshell. So if you were growing this indoors, if you're growing it in a greenhouse environment or somewhere in a part of the world where it couldn't grow outside, you would need to have it in the brightest, sunniest spot. So brighter and sunnier than Vandas and Cattleyas, because it needs that light to bloom, and if you don't give it that, you're going to really struggle, unfortunately. That's not dissimilar to many of the other Australian Dendrobiums like Kingianum, delicatum that I have as well. They do need a lot of direct sun, particularly in winter, otherwise you're never going to get good flower displays. So let's look at these pseudobulbs slash canes. They are just massive. Well, the whole plant is massive. It's huge and very heavy, and it will form a huge colony as well. So that's something to bear in mind. Not a plant for the space challenged or the faint of heart when it comes to handling big plants. Obviously, it will be easier in a plastic pot for that reason. It will be lighter. Mine, though, is of course in a terracotta pot because, you know, I live for terracotta. But what we can see is the canes, which have got the more silvery sheaths on them, are the ones that grew. So I think I had 1, 2, 3, 4. I think I had about 3 or 4 new canes growing very quickly in that year where it kind of sulked after I repotted it, which is brilliant because the canes can bloom in their first year. You don't have to wait a year for them to mature. So essentially, the more canes you have, the more flowers you're going to get. Ergo, it's a case of promoting vegetative growth, and there's not much you can do to really improve upon that other than giving it the base care that it needs, which is good light. So let's talk some basics then. Let's talk, and I'm going to swing the flowers around again so you can see them. Aren't they just amazing? And actually, I'm going to move it backwards so you can kind of see the whole thing. Look at that. Oh my goodness me. So let's talk about the potting mix. So in the video, if you have a look at that, you can see that I used basically an out of the bag potting mix because I use that for all my Aussie Dendrobiums, I have to say. But this is, as we know, a lithophyte, so it's living in those nooks and crannies of rock. So there will be a little bit of medium that builds up in there, leaf litter, etc., etc. So it's not like an epiphyte that clings to the side of a tree and it's literally just the roots and nothing else. There is a little bit of medium, but you want to keep it as light and airy as possible. You could just use really big bark, and I mixed in there some pumice stones. So you could mix bark and pumice stones, which loosens it all up. And I don't know, I'm kind of old-fashioned, and I feel that a lithophytic orchid sometimes wants its roots near some rocks. So pumice is a great rock to put in because it's quite pitted, so lots of moisture can retain in those little pits. A nice place for the roots to explore, I feel. Anyway, call me foolish. I always put rocks in my lithophyte orchid mix. And I also put some slow release fertilizer in there, and obviously a bit more than I would for other plants because it's so massive and puts on a lot of growth every year. So next care cab off the rank is watering. Now, these come from a variety of geographic regions, but essentially Australia has wet, cold winters, depending where you are. Obviously, the further north you get, the less cold they are. And we get hot, dry summers. However, the further north you get, the more subtropical it is, so the more there is a wet, dry, wet, dry, wet, dry cycle. So Australia is quite a mixed bag climatically and geographically. And this orchid kind of straddles a few different regions. If it's growing epiphytically up tropical trees, you can imagine that kind of condition. And if it's growing lithophytically on a cliff face, quite different. So I think a good rule of thumb with the Aussie Dendrobiums, whether they're Kingianum, Speciosum or delicatum, is to really go easy on the watering and let them really dry out. So Australia, even in the subtropical areas, isn't constantly moist. They are going to have quite prolonged periods of dry, and they can really deal with it. So lay off the watering would be my only advice, particularly in winter if you're growing it in a pot. If you imagine it's growing in the fork of a tree, when it rains, it's going to absorb the water it needs, and then the rest is going to drain away and evaporate really quickly. The same with a lithophytic plant growing on a rock face with all that sun beating down. All of that moisture that gets captured in there will evaporate really quickly. So the plant takes up what it wants. Look at the size of these pseudobulbs to store it, and then it's dry for quite some period of time. So I do often have a look at other people's instructions on nurseries selling them, and they do say, you know, the watering, yada, yada, yada. But I would say treat it relatively harshly and lay off the water. Fertilizer wise, like many orchids, particularly Australian orchids, they grow in really harsh environments. So a lot of their nutrients are going to be from whatever is collecting at the bottom of the plant. So obviously we've got to try and replicate that in pot growth. And so I kind of just fertilize it as I fertilize my other plants. Although I must say, I do tend to fertilize all of my Australian plants less than other plants like Oncidiums or Miltoniopsis or whatever they might be. Largely because out of sight, out of mind, they're all outside just doing their own thing. So there's a bit of that, but also they grow in quite tough environments, and I feel over fertilizing them might be a negative. Anyway, I do give it a topical application of a slow release fertilizer in spring around the top, which was part of my spring task video, which I'll link above. There was slow release fertilizer in the mix. And then when I remember, in the warmer season, I will give it a liquid dose of something, either an orchid specific liquid fertilizer or more of a tonic that is either, say, worm juice or a seaweed based solution, all of which I dial down to 1/6, 1/8, 1/10 of the recommended dose, because you don't want to overdo it. The other thing that I do with all lithophytic orchids is a little bit of garden lime on the top in spring, which I water in as well, because apparently plant lovers, so as the water is running down the stone, it is leaching out calcium and magnesium, obviously not to huge amounts, and lithophytic plants often, well, do have more available calcium and magnesium in their systems than other plants do. So garden lime, just a little bit, gives them that extra boost that it needs in terms of calcium and magnesium. So every spring, a little bit of that. I also do that with Phylogeny cristata, which is also can be a lithophyte, and my Dendrobium kingianum and my Dendrobium delicatum, which grow in similar situations. They can either be lithophytes growing in rock nooks, or epiphytes, but really growing in the nooks of trees, branches, or the root nooks at the bottom of the trunk of the tree. So similar conditions. Either way, a little bit of garden lime doesn't go astray. So as we saw, the pseudobulbs themselves are massive, and they will mature in one season, capable of blooming immediately. I think all of mine have got 4 leaves, and the leaves are really, really strong and leathery, which gives you the indication that they can take full sun. Generally, the tougher and more rigid the leaf is, the harsher conditions it can take. Although Phalaenopsis leaves are quite strong as well, and if you put those in the full sun, they will burn to a crisp. So maybe that's a rule with exceptions, but anyway. And the pseudobulbs, once they mature, are sort of like bamboo almost. They're really ridged with striations around them. Quite amazing. It's an amazing looking plant, very graphic and strong. Okay, so let's look at the flower. Now, as the good book says, there is a huge amount of variability in Dendrobium speciosum in the wild, and it naturally hybridizes in the wild. So Kingianum and Speciosum can meet on balmy nights and produce an offspring called Delicatum, which I also have. Beautiful flower. So there isn't sort of a single absolute in terms of what the flower looks like. And obviously in the last, well, quite a few decades, people have been hybridizing Speciosum even more to get bigger sprays or brighter yellow or paler white or whatever it might be. There's a huge number of variants of Speciosum out in the marketplace as it is. But looking at mine, so generally all the ones I've seen, like the classic Speciosum, is very yellow, but they can err towards the very pale, almost white lemon yellow as well, and that's considered to be part of the natural sort of variability of the flower. But if we look at the great book, my flower actually looks very like the painted example in this book. So very yellow, almost sort of canary yellow, with the lip that has this almost sort of tiger-like spotting, and I'll show you on the illustration because it shows it really quite beautifully. So I think it's kind of a classic Speciosum flower, I feel. There is a fragrance, but it's not earth-shattering, and it's very much like a daffodil, I think, but sort of dialed down. Now, Dendrobium delicatum, the other of this sort of group that I have, has the most beautiful, light, I think it's like a lilac-y fragrance. It's not yet quite out there. The buds are just about to start bursting open. It's been very wet and miserable here in Melbourne, so it's taken a while for things to open because there's been no sun and warmth. Anyway, that has a much more pungent fragrance, which is beautiful, and when you put that in the house, it really does fill the room. This Speciosum, not so much. But imagine though, I've only got one flowering cane. Imagine if all of those canes were in bloom. Different story. So flowering wise, the flower spikes emerge from the top of the cane, and usually there are 2 spikes per cane. So they form 2 little nubs, and then they just arch out like antenna, and ta-da, there you go. And the plant can flower continually, year on from the same spike. So often with an orchid, like Oncidiums for example, once the pseudobulb has bloomed, that's it. That pseudobulb is never going to flower again. Not the case with the Australian Dendrobiums like Delicatum, Kingianum and Speciosum. Each cane will continue to bloom until it reaches the end of its long life, and then you can snip it off. But the canes do last quite a long time, so bear that in mind. If you get any damage, and this one actually does have some sunburn, which I'll show you, it's going to be around for years to remind you just how badly you looked after your orchid. And I guess another thing which is, you know, not such a shock to many of you orchid growers is that they do like to be pot bound. Again, imagine it's growing in those quite confined, contained areas, either in rocks or in trees. There's no room for it to grow. But it does kind of spread out with its roots, forming quite a dense mat. And the ones that I have seen growing in tree stumps or in rocks in botanic gardens, the roots kind of form this mass over the thing that they were originally growing on. It's almost like they subsume it. Once they get going, they're quite vigorous growers, but it just takes a bit of time. And I will show you in here that the new roots that I've got growing across the top of the medium are already showing that kind of matting across the top of the medium, which is great. Obviously, anchors the plant, it draws up lots of nutrients, and it's a sign of great health. And you'll also be able to see that there's just lots of leaf litter lying on the top of this plant, and I'm not going to worry about that because in its natural environment it would have something very similar. So I think it's living its best life. Now, plant lovers, it's always vulgar to talk money, but in my other video I point out that I bought this specimen for 50 Australian dollars. Now, what a snip that was. It was described as a yellow flowering orchid, and there was just a picture, it wasn't in bloom, a picture of the canes, and I could tell by the picture that it was Speciosum or a variety therein. Something now this size and in bloom would be at least 150, if not more. And I was just at an orchid fair this weekend, in fact, where there were lots of flowering Speciosums, and they were hundreds, $100, $200, $300, $400 for some really massive plants with multiple flower spikes. So I did very well. But the other reason why they are so expensive is that they do take a huge amount of time to mature from seedlings. And one of the people at the orchid fair this weekend made the point of when he was first starting to grow orchids, he bought seedlings, as I have done, and I've suggested you do as well. Not this one. His point was they can sometimes take 10 to 15 years to get to flowering size. Who has got that amount of time? I'm 54. If I had to wait 15 years, I'm sorry. I mean, the world could be over before it flowers. Anyway, so there's a good point to bear in mind. I would not go buying yourself seedlings of Dendrobium speciosum. I would try and save up and be lucky like me and get a division, or buy a flowering plant from a specialist and just bite the bullet because it's going to be expensive. But worth it unless you've got 15 years up your sleeve. And the origin of the name, so we know Dendrobium, but Speciosum is Latin and it means beautiful or splendid or showy, and quite a good choice because honestly this plant is such a showstopper, I cannot tell you. Whenever I've seen them in bloom, they literally take your breath away because they're just masses of these either canary yellow or really pale lemon yellow flowers, and extraordinary when you can get more than one cane to bloom, but they are showstoppers. So Speciosum is highly appropriate, I feel. And the first specimen was collected in 1804 in an area that is now Sydney, so hence the common name of sometimes Sydney rock orchid, even though it grows in other parts of the country. So 1804, very early for an Australian plant to be named in the European nomenclature, devised by the godfather of taxonomy, Linnaeus. So there we are, plant lovers, Dendrobium speciosum. I just have to tip the camera back. Look at that. Oh my goodness me. It is quite the most staggering of the Australian orchids, I think, and just so dramatic and extraordinary. Wow, I am so happy because you do hear of them being temperamental and of people not being able to get them to bloom. So I was really happy that it sent out 2 spikes. I don't think it's going to bloom brilliantly for me until I can get it into a full sun position. But we are about to begin work on our house, which will only take 1.5 years. So maybe in 2 flowering seasons time, I'll be able to give it the sun it needs to bloom incredibly well. And we will do a follow-up then when it is just a mass of yellow flowers. So if you're trying to grow this in other parts of the world, do let me know how you're going. I am not an expert, but I've managed to get it to bloom once for me, so I'm quite happy with that. I think the tricks of the trade are keeping it on the dry side, keeping it tight in the pot, loose, medium, and light. As much direct sunlight as you can give it. And if you get burnt leaves, so be it. You'll get better flowers. So it is a bit of that compromise. So the best thing to do is just try and avoid, if you are in a warm climate like mine, avoid late afternoon direct sun, which is the hottest and the most burniest, but direct sunlight for the rest of the day if you can manage it. There we are, plant lovers. What a triumph. How exciting that is. I just don't know how I could possibly top it, but I don't need to bother. We will check back in with Speciosum in a couple of years, if we're all still here, to see how the blooms and the spikes have gone as it moves into its new sunnier spot. But until then, which is quite a while away, I do post every week on a Friday, so hit subscribe if you're interested in following my continuing orchidy journeys. And Dendrobium Speciosum and I wish you very well wherever you are, and I and Speciosum look very much forward to seeing you next week.